what other mistakes do people typically make on like a Form 1023?
You have to remember, if you're doing it yourself, be complete. Like, don't leave any blanks in the projected revenues. You are never held to those numbers as, if you don't meet them, you're in trouble, or that's not the case. But you can't just be fantastical about it and just make up numbers out of blue. They have to have some relationship to reality, so that if somebody did audit you, you would be able to explain, this is why I use that number. You would never want to say, I made it up, or I don't know, because then they could say, then you filed a frivolous application and we can revoke your tax exempt status.
Wow, that's a great tip. And when you're about to go form your entity, do you recommend people to have the board in place already before they form the nonprofit?
If at all possible, that's the ideal thing to do. Is that most people form a nonprofit and then start asking people they know if they want to be on the board. That their friends. It's usually their friends. I will say this in terms of advice: do not put your wife or your kids or your girlfriend or boyfriend on a board. It's just a bad idea. First of all, from a tax standpoint, it looks like you have familial control of a nonprofit, which makes it suspect to begin with from the Treasury's perspective. It's like, so the one guy dies and his son takes over his place, raking in the money every week. People don't realize how much of a force multiplier just two other people are in terms of energy and ideas and connections and networks. And so find two people that you like. Find two people that you have meaningful discourse with, that you've had conversations with, that are deeper than just like, hey, let's try to go to business together sometime, or let's try to do a nonprofit together. Because you have to kind of think in advance, what's it going to be like if we're on the board and we have to decide, do we make an application for this thing? Because if we make an application for HUD-related loans, for example, and we've never done it before, everybody on the board has to go through a certification with HUD, which means basically like a background and credit check from HUD. And so people need to be aware those things can happen in any nonprofit, depending upon the kind of grant or loan that they might be applying for, but especially in housing nonprofits.
Okay, welcome to another episode of Affordable Housing and Real Estate Investing. Guys, I'm so excited to welcome back Michael Eaton. Last time he was on the podcast, he schooled us on all things about HUD loans. One of the best episodes we ever did all about HUD loans. And today, he's going to be back talking to us about how to create a nonprofit, because I've heard from all of you, you've all been reaching out to me, asking questions about, how do I create a nonprofit? What's the best way to structure it? And I thought, who better than Michael to bring back onto the podcast? So Michael, man, how you doing today, man?
Doing? Well, I'm doing great. And this is, the subject matter is kind of right in my wheelhouse, because I started out back in the 80s, really representing community development corporations that were all nonprofit organizations. And here is like a little bit of trivia that will explain something that a lot of people probably, I don't know, maybe they do, maybe they don't wonder about it. So in terms of business organizations these days, by far the most common and the most prolific is the limited liability company, or LLC. And that didn't used to be the case. It used to be the case that everybody would incorporate as a corporation, which is just a limited liability company is just another form of specially insulated business organization that provides insulation from liability the same way a corporation does. So everybody forms LLCs now instead of corporations, and people wonder why. Well, it really all came about in 1998, because the Treasury came down with a regulation, and it said if there's a limited liability corporation, is the term that it used instead of company, but it's the same thing, and it has a single member, that the entity itself is disregarded for tax purposes, and that the tax status of the member flows through to the LLC. Now that sounds like, okay, who cares kind of thing. It's technical, but why do I care? Well, the reason it was important is because many nonprofits take the step after they are formed and they are merely nonprofit, which is really an accounting standard in terms of the way you're operated, and they want to become tax-exempt organizations. right? So if you are, in fact, a tax-exempt organization, what that meant was you as a nonprofit could form a limited liability company that your organization was the sole member of, and that LLC would be tax-exempt and could be a transactional entity for tax-exempt bond finance purposes. And that everybody who's ever done tax-exempt bonds gets stoked when they hear that, like, oh, yeah, man. But most people are like, that's complicated and boring, and I don't know anything about it, and I don't want to know anything about it. But what it did is from 1998 on, it meant that lawyers all over America were telling people, don't form a corporation, form an LLC because it gives you more flexibility from a tax standpoint. So there's that. So people are familiar with LLCs. When it comes to nonprofits, one of the things that I hear all the time that kind of, from a technical standpoint, the legal status of things, and you will hear people say, I have a nonprofit, or the person will say, she has or they have a nonprofit. It's their nonprofit kind of thing. And there are very few states, Delaware being one of them in the United States, where you can actually form a nonprofit corporation that has ownership, that has private ownership. So you can actually issue shares in a nonprofit corporation in Delaware, which makes like zero sense to me, since there are all sorts of incredibly arcane but incredibly powerful rules in the IRS about how people that operate within that organization have to be treated for tax purposes. And so it's kind of goofy that way. And I guess the point I'm trying to bring up is you can be like the patron of the creator of a nonprofit. You can create ways, although you have to be careful how you do it so that you don't have inappropriate transactional benefit. You can be compensated. You can have a nonprofit that compensates you, and some people have nonprofits that compensate them like ridiculously well, almost blasphemously well in some cases. So it's not a big deal. It's just people need to understand the concept behind a nonprofit from a kind of policy standpoint and theoretical standpoint is that you have a board of directors, and those board of directors have a fiduciary duty to the nonprofit. And kind of as a pass through for, you might want to think in terms of economics, is like a social good. The idea is really that the public at large owns the nonprofit. So it's a very communistic kind of thought in terms of ownership. It's like, just because we've created this and it has the potential to benefit a big segment of society, we're going to say society owns it, but the board of directors is the only one that can make decisions about what it does and about how it might be able to benefit the world as a whole. So the ownership by the public is not a legal ownership, it's more an equitable ownership. And it's a fictitious ownership, but it's a good way to think about it for people.
Yeah, and Michael, I want to draw the parallel to housing, right? So, I think at the highest level, how I understand nonprofits is nonprofit, at least for affordable housing, is formed for, to your point, for the benefit of a certain population, maybe it's creating affordable
Yeah.
housing. The board of directors has that duty to fulfill on that promise, and it in turn picks the president, certain C-suite executives to help manage the nonprofit to execute upon that mission, right? Is that like a
Yeah, yeah.
general understanding of the roles and responsibilities?
Especially within the context of affordable housing. So under the Internal Revenue Code and the underlying statute that led to the adoption of the 1986 Revenue Code, it has a bunch of kind of hyper technical delineations in there about what can happen to revenue that comes in. No part of earnings can be used to inure to the benefit of a private individual. And so inurement is a special kind of inside benefit, and it's fairly amorphous. And so Treasury has been very practical in the way they've approached it. What they've done is they've said, okay, every nonprofit that compensates its officers, if you don't compensate your officers, and a lot of them don't, fine. You don't have to worry about it. Just a big section of your tax return you don't even have to complete. If you do, you really have to have a salary survey. So that means you have to employ an HR professional to do the board of governors would do this, to do a salary survey to find out what similarly situated, it used to be similarly situated nonprofit executives. Now it's really just any similarly situated executive capable of nonprofit management or operation would be earning, right? And the salary surveys have a range. And if you, by hook or by crook, pay that person more than the top of that range, that is very likely going to be seen as inurement, that it's private benefit for the benefit that is benefiting that individual disproportionately because they're using the nonprofit status of the organization by taking extra money they get to have because they don't have to pay taxes, but instead of using it to further the public purpose of the charity, assuming it's a public charity, then you have this individual. Think of it as profiteering or just kind of overpayment or something like that. And inurement and private benefit are the ultimate bugaboos of nonprofits. They are the thing that I have spent 30 plus years admonishing people in the affordable housing industry about because there have been a lot of affordable housing developers that have created nonprofits that they have abused. There have been, hell, just in Texas that I know of, there have been about 4 people that have gone to prison and, millions of dollars of deals blown up and just all sorts of horrible things. It's just stupid and it's just over people being greedy. It's unnecessary.
I mean, so help people stay out of jail today,
How do they
Michael.
stay
So
out of jail?
they might be,
Yeah, so
they
the
might be
thing is,
looking at,
the first thing to stay out of jail is have a salary survey.
yes.
Do not have any kind of bonus structure or payment structure that looks like money from the nonprofit is going to private individuals based upon actions that they're taking that are not expressly in furtherance of the charitable purpose of the nonprofit.
So, I mean, you're not saying like, hey, at the end of the day, if you are a nonprofit that manages 1,000 units or 20,000 units,
Yeah.
that means you can't be compensated as another real estate firm that
No,
also
you
manages
become exactly the same.
Exactly.
And from an FASB, Financial Accounting Standards Board has some rules about how you have to account for money. But the primary accounting difference is that instead of having a gross profit, a pre-tax profit, you will just have a value of your assets and then retained earnings. And they have a couple of special terms they use for retained earnings, but it's the same thing. And that's really, I mean, there are many people who have worked for nonprofits and who have been founders of nonprofits that have done exceedingly well financially. And that's completely possible. But the reality is that most nonprofits, if they really have a charitable purpose, the kind of highest and best use of the nonprofit is typically engaging in the business of whatever it is that nonprofit is doing, right? So the danger that you get into is, for example, in a management company, if you have a nonprofit management company and you are managing affordable housing and that's all you have a fairly heavy tax risk. And the tax risk is, why are you nonprofit and this company over here that is your competitor that's a for-profit company is for-profit? You do the exact same thing for the exact same market. So you need to convince me why you're not just a management company. I don't really understand why you're saying you're a nonprofit. What's charitable about being a property management company? And then you say, but no, we are in affordable housing. And so we meet the affordable housing safe harbor because we're serving people in the lowest 40% of income. And for the most part, you'll probably skate on that. But that's one reason you actually see very few nonprofit management companies. You'll see a lot of companies that do just internal management. They don't have a separate management company. The nonprofit will manage their own real estate. And to be honest, from both an operational standpoint and a bottom line dollar standpoint, every nonprofit that I've seen that's used a third party property management company in every instance did better than ones that self-manage. I mean, like 100% of the time, because property management
Interesting.
sucks. I mean, that's
Yeah,
a,
it's
that's a
hard.
bad way to put it. But I mean, having to deal with the people management part of property management, which is dealing with all the individual property level leasing agents and resident managers and plumbing problems and porters that quit and a roof's got a leak. And that's the kind of stuff property management companies have to deal with all day, every day.
So you
So,
see 100% of the time that a
yeah,
nonprofit affordable housing
yeah. And so
company,
you end up
they're better
wasting
off
money.
hiring somebody.
Well, you end up wasting money
Ah,
a lot of times when you do that because you spend so much time dealing with those things. If you had just said, I'm going to cap my expense at, 4% or 3% or whatever I'm paying to this property management company, that's what I know. They're getting, 4 or 5% of gross collected rents. And that's all the money they get. They have to deal with all those headaches no matter how big they are. And they just hope that their portfolio is big enough that the risk for problems is spread wide enough that, that it ends up being profitable for them.
well, let's talk about why do people even start a nonprofit, right? So you hit on it in the beginning
Well,
about
yeah, a lot of
people used to
people just
form
have like
LLCs.
there's an issue. This is not intended to be sexist, but I'm sure it will come across that way. And it's unintended, but it's really an observation. And that is in the nonprofit world as a whole, the majority of nonprofits that were started by a person were started by a woman. I mean, probably 70%. And maybe it's just because those women are more motivated, or maybe it's because they're more passionate about a particular cause. But I mean, there's as many nonprofits as there are things you can think of just about. I mean, there's nonprofits for medical research, there's nonprofits for education, there are nonprofits for disease, there are nonprofits that are just to support like veterans or families of people that have whatever. I mean, anything you can come up with. And then there are nonprofits that do things like Goodwill. It's like we're going to collect things from people and sell them in stores as a way to employ people that otherwise would likely be homeless and hopefully give them a steady income, which is pretty cool. So in affordable housing, what I didn't finish saying before about the Tax Act of 86 and the regs is that they created a benefit for nonprofit participation in affordable housing. It's in the Home Investment Partnership Act, which is within HUD, the HUD enabling statute. And then, apart from the home benefit, there is the tax credit benefit, but it's kind of de facto. It's not federally mandated because the tax credit benefit is there is a set aside pool of 9% tax credits that are set aside to only be utilized by nonprofit organizations or by business structures that incorporate a nonprofit organization. In the home part, 15% of all investment partnership funds have to be set aside to be given to community housing development organizations, which by definition have to be nonprofits. So there's
Ah.
tax policy that encourages the creation of nonprofits. So that's one reason in the affordable housing world. And there's preferential kind of like Disney. When you go to Disney, it's like buying a fast pass. You're going to Six Flags, you buy a fast pass, you get to, jump the
Great
line. You're a
analogy.
nonprofit, you kind of get to jump the line, you get a tax credit application pool because you have fewer competitors and you know that a portion of the total credits have to be allocated to you, to your group. Anyway.
So Michael, I love to say it back to you because I want to make sure I'm following everything, right? So it sounds like creating a nonprofit, it helps you get preferential treatment. So a lot of times when people are applying for low-income housing tax credits in their state, they generally have to partner or joint venture with a nonprofit so that, in your words, like they can jump the line a little bit, get
Yes.
preferential treatment, so
Yes.
they can get more equity. But then they also get income tax I guess they get into income tax waived as a nonprofit,
Yeah.
and they
I mean,
also
they don't
sometimes
have
might get
any
property
income.
tax
I
exemptions.
mean, if
Like,
you're a nonprofit from an accounting standpoint and a tax standpoint, you don't have income as a definition. You have revenue, but you don't have income because you're a nonprofit. So you have revenue And then you have your basically cost of doing business. And that's the one thing the IRS has finally started being a little more scrupulous in their review of that kind of expense, because there have been people that started nonprofits that once they got a stream of revenue, they just treated that as like their personal checkbook, and so they finally have actually been enforcing those rules somewhat more closely than they used to.
So the expectation is that you create revenue, whether that's through some kind of revenue generation activity like donations,
Yeah.
advertisements,
Well,
whatever,
yeah, that's all
or rent.
any nonprofit so once you're a nonprofit in most states, you just form a nonprofit corporation. It's the easiest thing to do. And in most states, it's really cheap. I mean, whereas, starting an LLC or a corporation or limited partnerships, usually $300 or $400 filing fee. For a nonprofit corporation, it's usually like $50 or less. But then once you're formed, you're really nothing but a name, right? You haven't done anything. You're not worth anything. You can't do anything yet. You can call yourself a nonprofit. But like to get the preferential treatment and tax credits, you have to have, when you put your application in, you have to have a lawyer sign a letter. It's called a 42J letter that goes along with your application. And the lawyer says that they reviewed the business organization of the deal and that there is material participation by a qualified nonprofit in the business organization. And then you tell them how. Usually it's like because they own, 1% of the general partner or whatever, or they have to own 49% anymore. They've gotten more explicit. They have to own operationally half of a GP interest, like to have that constitute material participation. Yeah, so you have to do all those things to kind of get going, but
And
those are all kind of motivations for creating a nonprofit. There was a girl I went to high school with, that beautiful, beautiful girl, and still gorgeous this day. And she had a daughter who had leukemia, and then she had a bone marrow transplant, and she was recovering from the leukemia. And as she was recovering, she caught a antibiotic resistant staph infection, and she ended up dying. And she was only like 19 or something. It was horrible. And her name was Micaela. Sharon, her mom, I helped her start a nonprofit called Micaela's Army. And it was a fundraising thing to promote awareness of symptoms of juvenile leukemia, because the girl was a dancer and had gone to college on a dance scholarship. And the way she was diagnosed is that she thought she had injured her ankle in a dance practice, and it was bruised, and the bruise didn't go away. It just stayed the same color for like a month. And so that's when she went to the doctor, and they're like, "Oh my God, you have leukemia. And if you don't have a bone marrow transplant, you're going to die within like a couple of years." And then amazingly, she got a
wow.
bone marrow transplant from her only living sibling, who was a brother with Down syndrome. And he gave bone marrow transplant. She went into complete remission and then ended up
Wow.
passing away because it was just horrible. I don't know why I said it twice out loud, but that always affected me. But Sharon was obviously very motivated on behalf of her late daughter to promote the idea of this nonprofit. And there are many nonprofits that are done that way. They're done as a memorial to a person. Many of them institute the word foundation into their name, whether they are or not actually a foundation, a private foundation for tax purposes, which doesn't really have anything to do with, whether they're a charity or tax exempt organization. Anything has to do with how they handle their money.
Well, Michael, I think that's such a touching story. And I always think about like when people have that mission, right? They have the heart, they want to help people.
Yes.
Sometimes they come to me and they say, Ken, how would I structure? What are the options, right? So how do you answer that question
Well, I
typically,
always
Michael, when
say,
it comes to
find people that are as passionate about this subject matter as you are, and ask them if they're willing to be on a board, because most people don't do that, to be honest. I mean, most people don't take advice, but the idea is it helps your organization actually come into being organically, because there's this synergy between people of mutual passion for a single subject, you know? whether it's affordable housing or helping the homeless or better nutrition for kids or vaccine literacy. How about that? That would be a good one. Any of those kinds of ideas people are going to get motivated about. But if you have a group of people that also are motivated, then you don't have to have one person always being the one trying to push the train. You actually have a bunch of people pulling instead of you trying to push. And and then you form the organization, right? And so forming it, here's the problem though. At some point, I mean, you can't really have a valid nonprofit and have restricted voting rights. And what that means is if you have a nonprofit and you've got 4 people on your board, all 4 people have to have an equal vote. You can't disproportionately say, I started it, I get 50% of the vote. You can do that in a for-profit corporation. You cannot do that in a nonprofit corporation. So you have to think about, are these people that we're going to agree about things? You don't necessarily want a group of
Right.
just like yes people, but you also have to consider the circumstance that I've seen far too many times where some significant issue comes to the front and they're groups at loggerheads with each other. And when they vote, it's 2 against 2 always.
Oh,
you know, what you can do is you can have 3 people, so you only have to worry about 1 person. 2 out of 3 people are always gonna win the vote. Or I have seen where the board establishes a position of an executive director, and the executive director does not have a vote unless there is a tie between the other members of the board. And then in that case, the executive director is entitled to cast the deciding vote.
interesting. And you say 3 people just because you don't want to have such a large, unwieldy
I mean, at
board
some point,
size,
what
right?
we used to do a lot in housing, because community housing development organizations under the HUD regs have to have 1/3 of their board made up of either low-income people that live at the project that you're owning, other people that are low income that live in the same neighborhood but don't live in the same development, or representatives, and it used to say elected representatives, but now it just says representatives of low income resident groups. And so it's kind of that last one's hard because it's like you have to find somebody that has another group and then put them on your board. So it's easiest to just say, we're going to have 1/3 of our board be residents of our project. But what we used to do, there isn't anything in the HUD regs that says that those people have equal authority as the directors of the nonprofit. And so we would create what we called advisory boards. And the advisory boards would have usually a resident manager, maybe leasing agent, and then a bunch of people that lived there that knew the leasing agent and knew the manager. And those were the people that we used. And the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs said that was fine, that was fine to meet the HUD requirement when they used to give Chodo certificates out just from the department. Now they will only certify that you are a community housing development organization if you get a home funds award that's in conjunction with a Texas low income housing tax credit project.
So that requirement about having 1/3 of your board to be residents of your project, is that why typically folks would have a for-profit entity that owns the property, but then they would have a nonprofit management company that manages the property because then they don't want residents to be on a
I mean,
board?
you could do that. That seems kind of backwards to me. It's usually the other way around. It's usually, the nonprofit. So and let's back up. So we thinking about where a nonprofit fits in ownership structure. There's really not a clearly defined mandate about how that has to be done. It's really a negotiated business term of the nonprofit. So I've had nonprofits where we went in because they were big and powerful nonprofits that had a lot of impact and influence with the Texas Department of Housing. We wouldn't come in and say, yeah, we just want to get paid a, monthly social service fee and some little stipend at the front. We would come in and say, we want 20% of all net operating income. We want to be able to do certain things in terms of providing services and we want to be paid a social service fee in exchange for providing those services. So you can certainly do that.
Interesting. So so we talked about community housing development organizations. We know about 501(c)(3)s. Like, Michael, can you explain for the audience that just doesn't know all the options for creating a nonprofit? Like, are there different legal structures for creating a nonprofit?
So, yes, there are, but I would say this. There are some people that have formed limited liability companies and then qualified those as tax exempt organizations. You can do that, but my only question is why? You get like zero legal benefit from it. And in fact, if you want to look at it at the micro level, you spend about $300 extra in filing fees with the Secretary of State's office that are unnecessary, and you have no greater sense or level of control or limitation with that organization. So I just say, if you want to form a nonprofit, spend the $30 or whatever it is with the Secretary of State and form a nonprofit corporation. They have a fill in the blank form in Texas and in most states where you don't have to worry about some third party that's in the back of a airplane magazine saying that they'll form a Nevada LLC or corporation. But you just go in there to the Secretary of State site and fill it out. And it's like, I think it's $30, $30 or $35 now. What I was going to say is there are many nonprofits that people don't think about as being nonprofits. For example, churches. Churches are nonprofits. But while many churches have determination letters from the IRS saying that they are tax exempt, many churches just operate assuming that they are tax exempt without ever having gotten a determination letter, which is not not to
Wow.
be a pun, but that's not kosher. I mean, the presumption is every dollar that you take in as a human being inside the borders of the United States is income to you. That being the case, you don't really have many ways around that one with Treasury. So if you're gonna not pay taxes, you need to do a 1023 application for recognition of exemption that asks for a whole lot of very detailed information. And I will say this: that's one thing I've rarely seen anybody succeed with without having a lawyer do it for them because it's pretty complicated. But once you get your tax exemption determination, you get a letter that says you're tax exempt, then that means all of the other rules now kick in that govern how you have to be operated. But what it basically, in a fundamental way, it means that the government is determined that you are an organization that has charitable, educational, scientific, or religious themes or principles underlying it, and as such is entitled, under this broad view that we have constitutionally about privacy, that it's entitled to be exempt from taxes. And once you get that letter, and there are many churches that have that letter that have never incorporated. Something like 75% of all churches of every faith are just unincorporated associations because they're not really, I mean, there are legal theories that could hold the church responsible for things that people did already, but a lot of them don't feel the need, especially if they're like sectarian, like they're denominational. So, because they have like governing organizations. So, for example, like the Catholic Church, individual parishes typically do not have tax exemption determinations. Probably 40 years ago or 50 years ago or something, somebody at a bishop's office, some big bishop's diocesan headquarters, got a group exemption from the IRS that basically just said every church under us and any that ever gets formed under us is tax exempt forever.
Wow.
And you can do that. You can seek a group exemption to be able to create new things. It's just, it creates kind of an accounting nightmare. I have never seen
Oh my goodness.
how like
That's right.
sectarian churches do their books or taxes, and I don't know that I want to know, to be honest.
Well, that's so interesting. And Michael, is a 501(c)(3) typically the most common type of
Yeah, it
nonprofit
is.
that's
That's the one.
formed
The
for housing
C3.
purposes?
That's the specific language. Those are charitable, religious, scientific, or there's one more in there. But yeah, that C3 is kind of the broadest one. C3s are prohibited from participating in political processes. So if you're a 501c3,
Ah,
you cannot give money to politicians. You cannot give money to political causes. That you,
so not a
it,
super PAC. You can't donate to a
yeah,
super
it's like
PAC.
you as an individual can, but you as a nonprofit cannot. It's one of those, and you can't have your profits funneled for political purposes. That gets violated all the time by a bunch of folks in Northern Virginia, I can tell you from personal experience. Yeah, so,
Just
yeah,
highlight one.
C3 is there. C4s are like trade organizations. They're also nonprofits and they're tax exempt, but they have special rules. And then there are, I can't remember, it's a 5 or a 6. One of those is the one that you can still be tax exempt, but you can be political if you're like issue oriented. So, like, if you're the National Association of Women or something like that, that would be one kind of like that. It's oriented specifically for a particular political view and to advocate for that, but it's a nonprofit.
What if you're an affordable housing nonprofit, right? But you want to
Yeah,
support a
you want to be a
politician that's very
C3.
pro
You want to be a
affordable
C3,
housing? Okay.
and there's a bunch. I mean, when you get down to kind of the granular level, there are a bunch of both IRS and U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development regulations that explicitly categorize affordable housing as a charitable endeavor. So, by virtue of doing affordable housing, that is a charitable goal sufficient to qualify as a tax exempt organization. But then when you say, okay, I'm doing affordable housing, then the IRS has a whole bunch of other regulations dependent upon the form of financing that tell you what you can and cannot do in a particular situation, money wise, in terms of how those dollars get distributed, for example.
Interesting. I mean, in that situation, could you support like a politician or city councilor that's like pro affordable housing
It's one
change?
of these form over substance things in the law that we get to take advantage of periodically. There aren't a lot of them left. But it's one where we say, look, like there was this guy that died about a year ago that was a really dear friend of mine for a long time, and he was the founder and chairman emeritus of the Atlantic Housing Foundation. And from the time he started it in the 1980s until he died in 2025 or 2024, anybody that saw Atlantic Housing Foundation thought of Dan French. That's all they know. Like, oh, that's Dan French. That's Dan French's group. He used to be in the housing department of the city of San Antonio back in the 1980s and then went into affordable housing. And the reason I say that is Atlantic Housing could never give money to politicians, but Dan gave money to politicians all the time. I mean, he was very active in politics, and so were a lot of other housing people that were friends of mine. And I'd be representing them. We'd all be down there lobbying the same people in the state legislature that were working on housing bills and tax bills that related to housing. So, yeah, I mean, we could be actively in that and be active in a nonprofit. It's just the nonprofit itself can't take its money and assets and use them for a political purpose because they've
Thank you
essentially,
for
the
clarifying that.
people say, well, why not? And it's like, well, here's why not. You're not paying taxes. You got this kind of magical fairy dust from the government that says you don't have to pay taxes. But in exchange for that, we're going to say you waive a few of your free speech rights because we're not asserting all of our property rights with respect to your money.
Yes. Well, Michael, it sounds like it's filing to form a nonprofit is relatively easy, but maybe
Yes.
the Form 23,
Yeah.
1023
So
to get the tax
the first thing you
determination
do
letter
is
is harder
you get
part.
the certificate of formation of the nonprofit corporation that creates the entity. Then once you create the entity, you will go to the IRS and you will apply for an employee identification number. And you get that employee identification number, and that means that you now can complete a Form 1023, which is the application for recognition of exemption. That's how you get to be a 501c3. Now, here is a little technical information about 501c3 applications. So the underlying idea is that an organization is supposed to have been in operation, generating revenue, doing whatever its model says it's supposed to do for 2 years before it's actually entitled to a final determination of being a tax-exempt entity. The way that we have always gotten around that for 30 plus years is we got the IRS to agree that they would give us what we called an advance ruling letter. And so the way that you ask for an advance ruling, and it's really the only reason it's advance is that it's in advance of you being in business for 2 years. But the way that you do that, so in the 1023, there's a part that's detailed financial information, and it says, tell us the last 24 months of your operations, what your revenues were. It has them broken down into not too broad, fairly fine categories of expense and revenue. But at the same time, you're like, oh, but I just formed this. Don't want to be tax exempt. I don't have 2 years. Then right below that, it says, okay, if you hadn't been in operation for 24 months, then show us down here in a pro forma what your first 3 years of operations are going to look like. So you just take an Excel spreadsheet and you plug it in there. Most people get all freaked out about that. Like, oh my God, what numbers do I put in? It's like, well, hopefully if you're starting a nonprofit, at some point you need to sit down and figure out what's the point. I mean, it's great to have ideals and opinions. And I was in Dallas at a protest last Saturday, holding a sign and walking around, and that's great. But it's kind of, so what? I mean, what you really want to do is you want to figure out how you're going to generate revenue. To me, fundraising should always be a component of every nonprofit, even if it's a small one. There are some nonprofits that are affordable housing nonprofits that really kind of miss the boat in that regard, because you can apply for grants and forgivable loans from cities and counties and sometimes the state housing agency, virtually everywhere in the United States. And, there's no reason not to take advantage of that. And some of them are just like, oh, well, we're not going to fundraise. Well, that's part of fundraising, is applying for grants. It's not just asking people
Right.
to
Go
give you
figure.
money, although you can always do that. Should always go to the expense of having a website that has a click through that lets people go. There are multiple apps that are kind of collection services that do it just for nonprofits that charge a little commission for collecting all the money and processing everything and just giving you the net. So you figure out those 2 years worth and you put that in, and then the IRS comes back and says, okay, here's your advance ruling. Assuming that you do what you said you were going to do in terms of the way you operate, you will get a final determination in a year. So you don't have to wait 2 years, you wait a year. And then they'll send you a final determination. But it doesn't mean, the only difference is it says final on it. That's it. I mean, the advance ruling has everything you need. It says from this date of this letter onward, this organization is exempt from taxes. So that's what you look for. And and from a, somewhat crass but honest standpoint, within the affordable housing world, that's kind of part of the attraction of the nonprofit. Developers will say, to me, it sounds very crude, but they say, yeah, we really need to rent a nonprofit for this deal. And it's like, man, that sounds like somebody's prostituting themselves for it. I don't like that phraseology at all. It's like, renting a nonprofit. You say you want to partner with a nonprofit, you want to have a nonprofit incorporated
Right.
into your deal, you need some help from a nonprofit. And the deals that I like are ones that start out with, I get a call from some guy I've never heard of, and he's a developer from Indiana, and he's coming to Texas or, somewhere where I am. I'm back in Texas now. And he says, okay, I want to develop this. I need a nonprofit. And I put them together with somebody, that I've worked with, because I have dozens and dozens of nonprofits I work with. And I try to think of somebody that needs a deal, that's eligible for a deal, that's got capacity and is kind of in the same world, kind of geographically. And and put them together and then let them do a deal and then let the for-profit developer realize that the project itself throughout construction and operation gains real life material benefits from the participation of a nonprofit that provides social services and educational services. And then they're like, oh, wow, this isn't just like renting somebody. This is like, I like these guys and I like what they do. I want to connect with them. And then they do 3 or 4 deals together by themselves. That's what always makes me happy, is when makes me feel like a
That's
matchmaker.
cool. That's really cool. Man, that's such a good story. I'm so glad you shared that one, Michael, because I think a lot of people forget about the purpose that they're in, especially when they are just trying to build more housing
Oh,
constantly.
yeah.
They
Well, I mean,
forget
the
about
financing aspects of
livelihoods.
affordable housing are so stupidly complex that only those of us who have been willing to, like, hit our heads against brick walls for 30 years doing it really have a good insight for all the nuances of it. I used to say, I mean, I said this 25 years ago at the time. I said, I know for a fact that there aren't 5 lawyers in the state of Texas that do what I do. And Barry
That's
Palmer
right.
down at Coach Rose, whom I consider a mentor as well as a colleague, just a fantastic guy and a fantastic lawyer. He said, I think it's more like 3 and 2 of us are here. I was like, all right, man,
Oh my
I'll take
goodness.
that compliment. That's all right.
Well, Michael, let me try to wrap this up
Yeah.
because I want to ask you, what other mistakes do people typically make on like a Form 1023 that aside for the pro
Not
forma thing?
being
Like, what other mistakes do
complete.
they typically make that?
That you have to remember, if you're doing it yourself, be complete. Like, don't leave any blanks in the projected revenues, and don't be fantastical about them. You are never held to those numbers as, if you don't meet them, you're in trouble, or that's not the case. But you can't just be fantastical about them and just make up numbers out of blue. They have to have some
Mm.
relationship to reality, so that if somebody did audit you, you would be able to explain, this is why I use that number. You would never want to say, I made it up, or I don't know, because then they could say, then you filed a frivolous application and we can revoke your tax exempt status.
Wow, that's a great tip. And when you're about to go form your entity, I forgot to ask this one. Do you recommend people to have the board in place already before they form the nonprofit?
Have the board ready.
Yeah, have the board ready.
If at
Yeah.
all possible, that's the ideal thing to do. So most people form a
Mm.
nonprofit and then start asking people they know if they want to be on the board. If they're friends, it's usually their friends. I will say this in terms of advice: do not put your wife or your kids or your girlfriend or boyfriend on a board. It's just a bad idea. First of all, from a tax standpoint, it looks like you have familial control of a nonprofit, which makes it suspect to begin
Uh,
with from the Treasury's perspective. Treasury doesn't even like churches that are like that. And there are a lot of churches, like some of these big non-denominational things. It's like, so the one guy dies and his son takes over his place, raking in the money every week.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. So find people that believe in the mission
Yeah,
just
if
as
you
much
can,
as you
if you
are
find
before you form a
to
nonprofit.
me, that's the most important thing. It's not like people don't realize how much of a force multiplier just 2 other people are in terms of energy and ideas and connections and networks. And so find 2 people that you like. Find 2 people that you have meaningful discourse with, that you've had conversations with, that are deeper than just like, hey, let's try to go to business together sometime, or let's try to do a nonprofit together. Because you have to kind of think in advance, what's it going to be like if we're on the board and we have to decide, do we make an application for this thing? Because if we make an application for HUD related loans, for example, and we've never done it before, everybody on the board has to go through a certification with HUD, which means basically like a background and
Oh,
credit check from HUD. And so people don't think about that. And so people need to be aware those things can happen in any nonprofit, depending upon the kind of grant or loan that they might be applying for, but especially in housing nonprofits.
wow. That's such a great tip. I'm going to highlight that one for sure for people because I don't think that people understand that. They're like, they might find someone to be on the board, but they forget about all these implications when they go to apply for HUD
Yeah.
financing. That's such a
Yeah.
great point,
People
Michael.
don't think about it's kind of like I used to tell people, why you write a contract? Why do you write a contract? You don't write a contract. In some ways, you write a contract to give people guidance about what you're supposed to be doing in an agreement between the parties. But mostly you have a contract in case one of the people that's a party to the contract don't do what they're supposed to do. That's the only reason we create it.
Right.
So we have a standard against which we can measure their behavior and impose some societal mandate upon them in the form of civil or criminal justice, depending upon what they've done. And so, likewise, the reason you have a board is there may be disagreement about what to do. And you need to think about what people you're going to want to have those kinds of discussions with because they're going to have to be meaningful and you have to be engaged. And you don't want people who are just going to say whatever you want to do. You need people that are going to stand up and have their own ideas. It's fine if they respect the person that's identified as kind of the primary or the founder or whatever as having that position, but you want people that will say no to you as much as they'll say yes to you.
Man, Michael, you have been so helpful today. And sometimes with your experience, sometimes I don't even know what are the right questions to ask you sometimes because you have so much
Oh,
experience.
I
And
mean, it always
maybe I'll
works
pose this
out,
one to
and
you,
sometimes
Michael.
we just go with the flow.
Well, Michael, is there like a question that you think people should ask you when it comes to forming nonprofits,
That's
affordable
a
housing
good
that
one.
I might not have asked you today?
Well, yeah, actually. So
Take your time on
one
this
of
one.
the things people should, and many of them do ask is, okay, if I form this nonprofit, can I pay myself right away? And the answer is,
Ah,
well, potentially yes. But it all depends in each case on exactly what the nonprofit is doing to generate revenue. There are some nonprofits that the only thing they do is fundraise. That's like their only thing is all they do is fundraise for other nonprofits. And they are paid a portion of what they collect. So if that was your nonprofit, it would not be kosher for you to start up the nonprofit, be the founder and sole board member, and then start this fundraising company and just pay yourself all the revenue from doing that and claim that, but it's a nonprofit because we're helping nonprofits raise money because you're just exploiting the system for personal gain. And so there would be absolutely nothing wrong, however, with that person having an employment agreement with the nonprofit that says, I'm employing you as an executive director and you're going to be paid $75,000 a year and you're going to have health insurance benefits and you're going to have nonprofits can't do 401ks if they do it themselves. They have to do a 403b, which is the same kind of thing, but it's for nonprofit institutions. So you could do pension, kind of retirement kind of things. So yeah, you could do all that. It's just you have to create a model that is going to generate revenue. One of the things that is, I hate saying this because there's been this big move over the past 25 years to operate nonprofits as if they're for-profit corporations. There are even a couple of business schools that have classes that are like that, which is I find very troubling because it's almost like, we're trying to legitimize a way for you to cheat the tax system. But in this instance, it's kind of a good way to think about the nonprofit when it starts out. And that is think of it from a for profit standpoint. How much money is it going to cost to keep this operational until I have sufficient revenue coming in from whether it's selling a product or fundraising or getting a grant from somewhere or being paid a percentage of net operating income or being paid a monthly. One of the ways nonprofits most easily get involved with affordable housing is instead of being involved in the ownership structure, they come in after the fact and they enter into contracts to provide social services in the nature of support services, usually in like a community center or clubhouse kind of environment at multifamily site, and they get paid a monthly fee for doing that. A lot of times they'll do English as a second language, they'll do after school tutoring, There'll be childcare, and then there's sometimes some vocational stuff, which is always good.
Wow. This is so good, Michael. Man, I've learned so much. I know we're getting towards the end. I know you probably have to run soon, but Michael, I would love to bring you back on. Maybe at some point we actually go through like a Form 1023, just go through it. And I
Sure,
think that will
we
make
could
people feel a little bit
absolutely do
less
that.
afraid. Yeah, would that be fun, man?
Yeah,
Dude,
well, I don't know
I
how
would be
fun it would
pumped
be,
for
but
that.
it'd be fun for me, to be honest. That's how boring my life is, that I have a blast with an
Are you
IRS
kidding
form.
me? I would be jazzed. I would be jazzed to do that with you.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's definitely what we're gonna do next,
Okay.
man. And Michael, for people that want to reach out to you, where can they find out more information about you, man?
You can reach me at my personal Gmail is Michael Eaton, MichaelEaton, PhD @gmail.com. Or you can also get me at my law firm address, which is MW Eaton@eatonlaw.com. So fire me an email, chat me or whatever, and I'm around. You can always ask anything you need to.
Man, Michael, this has been so fun. I cannot wait to bring you
Yeah, it'd
back
be
onto the
fun.
podcast. Man, I
Print
really
one
gotta
out.
thank you.
Maybe I'll get one of the ones that's blue. It's like a real official one.
Yes.
And I may have to slide over to the IRS in Fort Worth to pick up some of those, but I gotta go over there anyway, so okay. It was great seeing you, man.
Man,
I'm glad things are well, see your daughter's growing, and it's
yeah.
awesome.
Man, I can't thank you enough, man. Without you, this podcast would have never been the top podcast for affordable housing investments. And Michael, I'm just so grateful for you coming
Well,
on and sharing your wisdom. Because
more than happy to be on here. It's always great to see you, Kent, and hope you have a great rest of June.
yeah, sounds good, man. Hey, I appreciate you,
You
buddy.
bet, bud.
Have an amazing day,
All right, we'll
man.
talk to you soon.
And
All right,
we
bye-bye.
are out.